As the waters of the Euphrates slowly pull back, an entrance that remained hidden for centuries is beginning to surface, a mysterious cave that may lead far deeper into the buried past than anyone expected. The Euphrates River has carried the memory of entire civilizations, flowing above layers of history sealed beneath sediment and stone. Now, with water levels falling faster than in previous decades, archaeologists are starting to reveal what may be the opening to an ancient underground system, a cave connected to forgotten structures, tunnels, and the scattered remains of a once thriving settlement. What first appeared to be a routine geological exposure is quickly turning into a discovery that could reshape what we know about the region's past. If you're fascinated by history, unexplained discoveries, and deep investigations, be sure to subscribe, like this video, and share your thoughts in the comments. At first, there was nothing unusual about the stretch of land where the discovery began. For generations, the Euphrates had flowed over this region with quiet consistency, its surface revealing little about what lay beneath. Fishermen passed the area daily. Farmers worked fields not far from the riverbanks. From above, the landscape appeared unchanged, another ordinary segment of one of the world's oldest rivers. But as seasonal water levels dropped further than expected, something unfamiliar began to take shape along the exposed riverbed. A dark opening carved into a slope of hardened sediment, partially hidden by layers of compacted clay and stone. It did not look dramatic at first glance. In fact, it was small enough that many early observers assumed it was simply a natural erosion pocket created by shifting currents. Yet what caught the attention of survey teams was not the size of the opening, but its structure. The edges appeared too defined, too stable, as if reinforced by something beneath the surface. When the first exploratory lights were directed inside, the beam did not end in a shallow hollow. Instead, it disappeared into a passage that extended farther than anyone standing at the entrance could see. That moment, quiet, almost uneventful, marked the beginning of what would quickly become one of the most closely watched archaeological investigations in the region. Initial entry into the cave revealed a narrow corridor, its ceiling surprisingly even, its walls marked by patterns that did not resemble ordinary fracture lines. In several sections, the stone looked smoothed, almost worked, as though generations earlier someone had expanded what might once have been a natural cavity. The air inside was noticeably cooler, still, and layered with the faint mineral scent typical of spaces that had remained sealed for long periods of time. Small fragments of pottery began appearing near the edges of the passageway, not scattered randomly, but resting in pockets along the walls, as if they had been left there deliberately. A few meters deeper, the ground shifted from loose sediment to a more compacted floor, showing faint depressions that researchers suspected might once have been foot-worn pathways. None of these signs alone confirmed anything extraordinary. Natural caves can mimic surprising patterns, and rivers have a long history of exposing ancient debris washed in from distant locations. But the deeper investigators moved, the more the environment suggested that this space had not simply formed on its own. Subtle turns in the corridor seemed almost directional, leading toward chambers that widened with unusual symmetry. Sections of the wall bore faint discolorations, darkened patches, that some believed could be remnants of soot, hinting at the possibility that fire had once been used here. If true, it would mean the cave had not merely existed beneath the river, it had been occupied. What unsettled researchers most was not any single object they encountered, but the growing sense that the visible entrance represented only the smallest fraction of what might lie beyond. Ground-penetrating scans taken outside the slope began to indicate hollow spaces extending deeper into the surrounding formation, suggesting that the newly exposed opening could be connected to a far larger underground structure. And if that proved correct, the cave now visible along the receding edge of the Euphrates might not be an isolated find at all. It might be the first accessible doorway into an underground network that had remained hidden for thousands of years, waiting silently beneath the river's shifting waters. As exploration teams moved beyond the first corridor, the character of the cave began to shift in ways that were difficult to ignore. The narrow passage gradually opened into a wider chamber, where the floor was no longer covered only by loose sediment. Instead, patches of flattened ground appeared, almost as if the surface had been intentionally cleared long ago. It was here that researchers began noticing the first unmistakable signs that the space had once been used rather than simply formed. Near the base of the walls, partially embedded in the dust, small pottery fragments started to emerge, some plain, others marked with faint geometric lines that remained visible even after centuries underground. Each piece alone seemed insignificant, but together they suggested activity, repetition, and time. Further inside the chamber, the discoveries became more deliberate. Several intact clay vessels were found resting in shallow depressions carved into the rock, positioned upright rather than scattered as debris normally would be. Their placement immediately raised questions. Containers carried by flowing water tend to break, tumble, and settle irregularly, yet these remained grouped in ways that implied careful handling. Close to them, investigators uncovered stone tools worn smooth along their edges, the kind typically associated with cutting or scraping tasks. What made the moment especially striking was not the objects themselves, but the realization that they had likely remained untouched since the last time human hands had placed them there. Lighting equipment revealed additional details that had been invisible at first glance. On several wall sections, faint markings appeared, shallow carvings that followed repeating patterns, too consistent to be accidental fractures. Some resembled simple tally-like strokes, while others curved into shapes that researchers could not yet identify. Whether symbolic, decorative, or purely functional, their presence reinforced the growing impression that the chamber had once served a defined purpose. Even the ceiling offered subtle clues. Small, darkened patches, barely visible unless illuminated directly, hinted at the possibility that fire had once burned in the space, leaving behind thin layers of soot that time had not completely erased. The more the team documented, the clearer one thing became. This was no longer just the discovery of a cave entrance. It was the gradual exposure of a location where people had lived, worked, or gathered at some point in the distant past. Yet despite the growing number of artifacts, the chamber still felt incomplete, almost transitional, as if it were only the outer section of something larger. Preliminary scans suggested additional hollow zones deeper beyond the visible walls, spaces that had not yet been reached, but seemed connected by narrow internal passages hidden behind layers of rock and sediment. If those readings proved accurate, the items now being catalogued might represent only the earliest layer of a far more complex underground site. And what investigators would eventually find beyond these initial chambers could change not only how this cave is understood, but how the entire surrounding region is mapped historically. If you're curious to see what lies deeper inside this expanding discovery, take a moment to like the video and follow along, because what researchers began uncovering next would raise even more questions than answers. The discovery that truly changed the direction of the investigation did not come from a dramatic collapse or a sudden hidden chamber swinging open, but from a detail so subtle that it was almost overlooked. While documenting the far wall of the main chamber, one survey team noticed a section of stone whose texture differed slightly from the surrounding rock. At first glance, the variation seemed minor, just another irregularity shaped by centuries of mineral deposits. But closer inspection revealed something unexpected. A narrow vertical seam running from the floor upward, nearly straight. Too precise to be a natural fracture. When loose sediment was carefully brushed away, the outline of what appeared to be a partially sealed passage began to emerge. Removing the outer layer of compacted debris took hours, each motion slow and deliberate to prevent structural instability. Gradually, the seam widened into an opening large enough for a camera probe. What the lens captured on the other side immediately altered the tone of the entire project. Instead of solid rock, there was empty space, another corridor, extending forward at a slight downward angle, its ceiling arched in a way that suggested reinforcement rather than erosion. The walls inside this newly revealed passage were smoother than those of the outer cave, with faint linear marks that some specialists believed could be tool impressions left during excavation centuries, perhaps even millennia, earlier. When the first team members carefully entered the corridor, they found that the ground beneath their boots felt different as well. Rather than uneven sediment, the surface was more compact, layered with fine dust that appeared to have settled undisturbed for an exceptionally long time. The air was heavier, almost sealed, carrying the distinct stillness typical of spaces rarely exposed to open circulation. Every step echoed farther than expected, indicating that the passage did not end nearby but continued deeper into the formation. Portable scanning equipment soon confirmed what the acoustics suggested. The corridor stretched far beyond the range of visible light, bending slightly as it descended, with multiple hollow pockets branching from its sides. This raised a question far more complex than the earlier discoveries of pottery and carvings. Natural caves can form labyrinths over thousands of years, but the structural consistency of this corridor, the measured width, the stable arch, the absence of collapse patterns common in erosion channels pointed toward intentional design. Whether expanded from an existing cavity or carved entirely by human effort, the tunnel represented a level of planning that implied a destination. Passages like this are rarely constructed without purpose. They connect something to something else. Speculation began almost immediately. Some researchers proposed that the tunnel might have served as a protected access route during periods when the river flooded the surrounding terrain, allowing movement between elevated settlements and storage areas hidden beneath the surface. Others suggested it could have been part of a much larger underground system, one that had gradually disappeared from historical memory as the river shifted its course over centuries. Whatever the explanation, the newly opened corridor made one fact increasingly difficult to ignore. The cave at the river's edge was no longer the central mystery. It was becoming clear that what investigators had initially entered might only be the outer threshold of a far more extensive network, still concealed in darkness, waiting to reveal how far beneath the... As the newly discovered tunnel was mapped section by section, the investigation reached a point where the passage no longer felt like an isolated corridor carved into stone. Roughly 200 meters beyond the sealed entrance, the tunnel widened unexpectedly, opening into a chamber far larger than any previously encountered space within the cave system. The shift was gradual at first, the walls drifting farther apart, the ceiling rising higher with each step, until the confined corridor suddenly gave way to an open interior that forced the exploration team to pause. Their lights no longer reached the edges of the chamber all at once. Instead, beams moved across surfaces that seemed structured rather than natural, revealing shapes that resembled foundations, platforms, and low-standing stone alignments partially buried beneath layers of dust. Initial reactions were cautious. Underground formations can sometimes create geometric illusions, and centuries of sediment movement can shape rock into misleading outlines. But the more the area was cleared, the more unmistakable the evidence became. Sections of stone appeared stacked in deliberate patterns rather than scattered by collapse. Flat surfaces formed right-angled corners. Narrow gaps between blocks suggested joining techniques rather than accidental separation. Even more telling was the presence of compacted flooring areas where the ground had been pressed and leveled in a way unlikely to occur through natural processes alone. It was here that investigators began to consider a possibility that had not seemed realistic when the cave entrance was first discovered. The tunnel might not simply lead through empty underground space, it might lead to the buried edge of a settlement. Careful excavation along the chamber's perimeter revealed fragments of worked stone pillars lying at shallow angles beneath the sediment, their bases still partially embedded in what appeared to be foundation sockets. Nearby, broken sections of ceramic storage containers emerged, larger than those found in the earlier chambers, suggesting the area may once have been used for storing goods rather than daily habitation. Some fragments carried faint pigment traces, evidence that surfaces in this underground environment might once have been painted or marked. Although the colors had nearly vanished with time, the surviving residue hinted that the chamber had not always existed in darkness. It may have functioned during a period when sections of the structure were open to the surface, long before shifting river channels and sediment layers gradually sealed it below ground. Ground-penetrating scans soon expanded the scale of the discovery even further. Beneath the visible chamber, the instruments detected additional rectangular anomalies, subsurface shapes, aligned in rows that did not match the irregular patterns typical of geological cavities. The data suggested multiple structural layers extending outward beyond the accessible area, forming what could be the remnants of interconnected rooms or storage complexes still buried under meters of compacted earth. If confirmed, this would mean the chamber investigators were standing in represented only the uppermost portion of something much larger, the partially preserved edge of a built environment hidden for centuries beneath the shifting terrain of the Euphrates floodplain. What had begun as the exposure of a single cave entrance was now evolving into a far more complex picture. The corridor was no longer just a passage. The chamber was no longer just an underground hollow. Together, they appeared to form the surviving access route to a structure that had once been part of a living settlement, one that may have slowly disappeared as the river changed course, burying entire sections of human construction beneath water, sediment, and time. And if the scanning data proved accurate, the deepest portions of that settlement had yet to be reached, lying somewhere farther ahead in the darkness, still sealed behind layers that no one had yet uncovered. What began to reshape the investigation was not a single artifact or structure, but a pattern that started appearing as multiple survey teams compared their independent scans. The deeper mapping of the underground chambers revealed something unexpected. The tunnel system did not end at the ruins that had already been uncovered. Instead, faint but consistent signals indicated the presence of additional voids, extending outward in several directions, some positioned at slightly different depths, others aligned along what appeared to be a repeating structural grid. Individually, each hollow space might have suggested nothing more than natural erosion pockets. Together, however, they formed an arrangement that looked increasingly deliberate. To verify the readings, remote probes were guided into several partially blocked side passages branching from the main corridor. The cameras transmitted images of narrow transitional tunnels, their walls smoother than surrounding stone, and, in some sections, reinforced by stacked rock supports that had somehow survived centuries of pressure from the overlying sediment. One passage led to a compact chamber containing only collapsed debris, but another revealed a small rectangular space whose floor appeared level and cleared, similar to the earlier storage area discovered in the larger chamber. No artifacts were immediately visible, yet the geometry of the room suggested it had once served a specific function rather than forming by accident. As additional scan layers were processed, researchers began to notice a repeating spacing pattern between the detected chambers. The intervals were too regular to be coincidental, hinting that the structures might once have belonged to an organized underground extension of a settlement rather than isolated rooms scattered at random. If this interpretation proved correct, the cave entrance exposed along the riverbank would represent only one surviving access point into a network that could stretch far beneath the surrounding terrain. Some preliminary projections suggested that portions of the system might extend well beyond the area currently exposed by the retreating waterline, still buried under intact layers of sediment that had not yet shifted. This realization introduced a new possibility that had not been seriously considered during the early stages of the excavation. Instead of viewing the cave, tunnel, and chamber discoveries as separate findings revealed one after another, investigators began to see them as connected components of a single underground design, one that may have evolved over generations as communities adapted to the unpredictable flooding cycles of the Euphrates. Subterranean corridors could have provided protected routes between storage areas, sheltered workshops, or emergency refuges during seasonal rises in water level. Over centuries, as the river gradually changed its course, the entrances might have been sealed naturally, leaving the deeper network preserved in darkness while surface settlements vanished or relocated. Yet the most intriguing aspect of the scans was not simply the size of the possible system, but the fact that large portions remained inaccessible, separated from the explored sections by layers of compacted rock and debris. In several directions, the mapping signals continued far beyond the current excavation boundary, fading only where the scanning equipment reached its technical limits. This meant that what researchers had documented so far, corridors, chambers, storage zones, and structural foundations, might represent only the outer edge of a far more extensive underground complex still waiting to be uncovered. If future excavations confirm the full extent of these hidden structures, the implications could extend beyond the discovery of a single lost site. It would suggest that beneath the shifting floodplains of one of history's most important rivers, entire segments of ancient infrastructure may still lie intact, concealed not because they were destroyed, but because the river itself slowly covered them, layer by layer, until the modern world forgot they were ever there. As researchers continue to document the expanding underground structures, one realization quietly settles in. Discoveries like this do not happen only because someone goes looking for them. Sometimes they appear because the environment itself begins to change. For centuries, the Euphrates River concealed what lay beneath its waters, covering chambers, corridors, and fragments of human construction under shifting layers of sediment. Now, as water levels recede and long-buried ground begins to re-emerge, the past is not being excavated in the traditional sense. It is gradually being exposed by the river's own transformation. This raises a deeper reflection. Civilizations have always depended on rivers for survival, yet those same rivers also function as keepers of memory, storing traces of human history in the layers they deposit over time. When those layers shift, history does not vanish. It returns, often at moments when the world is prepared to see it differently. Whether these newly revealed spaces represent isolated remains or the outer edge of a far larger hidden network is a question that future excavations may answer. But even now, one thing is clear. What is emerging beneath the Euphrates is not only an archaeological discovery, it is a reminder that the past has never truly disappeared. It has only been waiting beneath the surface for the moment it could be seen again.